Dr. Maher, for your scholarly introduction and your kind words about me. I hope you will not be disappointed. I will not attempt to give a general definition of consciousness, as there is no generally agreed upon definition, and trying to do so would not really be very meaningful. What I will do instead is consider the nature of consciousness at 4 distinct levels, with focus on the upper 2 levels. Now, the first level is that of awareness of the environment and response to environmental stimuli. So let me just here just use the PowerPoint. Just it takes a. Okay, so the first level, therefore, is that of awareness of the environment and response to environmental stimuli. Now, this basic level is what is commonly understood by consciousness. In the absence of this level, the person is said to be unconscious. And this is the only level of consciousness that babies have up to the age of about a year or so. And it is the level of consciousness that we partially lose when we go to sleep. This basic level of consciousness is the substrate of all mental activities that one is aware of. For all these mental activities would cease when one completely loses consciousness. Animals, of course, have this level of consciousness. Now, several quantitative measures of the degree of consciousness at this level are available, such as the Glasgow Coma Scale, which measures 3 types of responses and assigns a value, a numerical value. Oops, sorry, it seems that. Oh, sorry, no. And assigns a numerical value to each of 3 types of responses: eye-opening, verbal response, motor response. And then, according to the total score, the patient is diagnosed as, say, having minor brain injury or moderate brain injury, or to be in a coma state. Now, the Glasgow Coma Scale is a useful clinical tool for assessing the severity of brain injury and for monitoring recovery. The next higher level of consciousness is that of self-awareness, that is, identifying oneself with the physical form of the body. And children develop this self-awareness at the age of about a year to a year and a half. When a child of this age looks in a mirror, he realizes that what he sees is his body image, having head, eyes, arms, legs, fingers, and so on. Do animals have this self-awareness? Well, in 1970, psychologist Gordon Gallup let some chimpanzees play with mirrors. Then he anesthetized them and painted red spots on their faces. When they looked at themselves in the mirror, after recovering from anesthesia, they tried to rub the spots from their faces. This was considered evidence of their recognizing themselves in the mirror. That is, they showed self-awareness or awareness of their body image. This became as the mirror test for self-awareness. Since then, several animal species have passed this mirror test, such as elephants, dolphins, and some species of birds, and even fish. The third and higher level of consciousness is that which is referred to as the conscious self. And this is the essence of being a unique human individual and is at the root of cultures and civilizations. It involves volition, that is making decisions, free will, choosing between alternatives, subjective phenomena such as sensations, feelings, ideas, thoughts, opinions, attitudes, personal values, one's own past experiences, one's own desires, hopes, and plans for the future. So, excuse me, so it is this conscious self that provides the unity of being and continuity in time that defines each human being as a unique individual. What is the relationship between consciousness and brain activity? Well, considerable research has been done since the 1950s on the neural correlates of consciousness. That is the neural activity or electrobiochemical processes in the brain that correlate or are associated with states of conscious experience. Many such correlates have been proposed over the years, ranging from synchronized oscillations of electrical activity in the cortex of the brain to interactions between electroionic activity and electromagnetic activity in the brain to quantum mechanical phenomena. Continuing advances in neuroscience and in other branches of science are expected to lead eventually to identifying physical processes that are associated with various aspects of consciousness. But would this explain consciousness? According to the Australian philosopher David Chalmers, associating neural phenomena with consciousness is the easy problem of consciousness. Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness is why should these physical processes give rise to a subjective experience at all? If one looks at a red rose, for example, the light reflected from the red rose excites certain cells in the eyes and generates electrical signals that travel to the brain and are processed in parts of the brain in a manner that is at present not very well understood, but which might well be known in the future. The resulting activity in the brain is then associated with looking at a red rose. This is a subjective experience that is unique to every individual, both in itself, that is how vivid is the red color, for example, or in the associations that it evokes, such as a bouquet of red flowers on a happy anniversary. But the question is, why should these physical processes give rise to something that is subjective? One might assert that these physical processes are themselves the subjective experience. So that's it. One need not look any further. This view, known as the identity theory of consciousness, is a purely materialistic theory that everything is eventually explained by physics, chemistry, and neuronal interactions. But this merely denies the question and does not answer it. Namely, why do all these purely physical processes give rise to something that is subjective in the mind, which is non-material? This is an aspect of what's known as the mind-brain problem. That is, what is the relation between the brain as a material physical structure and the mind as a non-material phenomenon? Many theories have been advanced over the years concerning the mind-brain problem. At one extreme are the purely materialistic theories, which many philosophers and most scientists accept. That is, the mind is simply what the brain does. But even if the neural correlates of all the distinct aspects of consciousness are identified, there still remains the question of how are they all combined in the unity of conscious experiences in each individual, and why are they unique to every individual? One cannot say, well, we do not have sufficient knowledge at present to explain everything in terms of physical brain activity, but this knowledge is certain to be acquired in the future. Such thinking is a matter of faith, not science. In fact, such an assertion is an example of what is known as counterfactual definiteness and is not admissible in science. An everyday example of counterfactual definiteness is to say, if I didn't have breakfast today, I would have gone hungry. That may well be true based on common experience, but it cannot be stated as a fact simply because it didn't happen. The fact is you had breakfast and didn't go hungry. At the other extreme are the dualists who believe that the mind and brain are two separate entities. This view was in fact advanced in the 17th century by the French philosopher, mathematician, and scientist René Descartes, and is held by many philosophers and some scientists today. The problem that dualism does not answer is what exactly is the nature of the mind as a separate entity from the brain, and how does it interact with the brain? I would like to quote here some views about consciousness that challenge the purely materialistic theories. Sir John Eccles, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for his contributions in neurophysiology, is an outspoken dualist. He says, since materialist solutions fail to account for our experienced uniqueness, I am constrained to attribute the uniqueness of the self or soul to a supernatural creation. I submit that no other explanation is tenable. Then he goes on to say, I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claim in promissory materialism to account eventually for all the spiritual, that is non-materialistic world, in terms of patterns of neuronal activity. This belief must be classed as superstition. Philosophy professor Alva Noe says that the idea that consciousness is a phenomenon of the brain, the way digestion is a phenomenon of the stomach, is as fantastic as the idea of a self-playing orchestra. The musical instruments of an orchestra do produce musical sounds, but the instruments are played by musicians, people outside the instruments, and the music is written by a composer. The instruments do not make the music by themselves. Then he goes on to say, after decades of concerted effort on the part of neuroscientists, psychologists, and philosophers, only one proposition about how the brain makes us conscious, how it gives rise to sensation, feeling, subjectivity, has emerged unchallenged. We don't have a clue. Well, that pretty well sums it. Now, do animals have this level of consciousness? Well, the consensus is that animals do have varying degrees of this level of consciousness, but nothing like the conscious self of humans. Now, an intriguing aspect of consciousness is its relation to quantum theory, which is the theory that was developed in the first quarter of the 20th century to explain phenomena at the atomic level that in fact were in contradiction of classical theory. It is referred to as quantum theory because it arose from the premise that energy is quantized, that is, it consists of discrete units or quanta, just like matter consists of discrete units, the atoms. And just like money, for example, consists of discrete units. Quantum theory has proved to be extremely successful and has remained unchallenged to this day. No prediction of quantum theory has proved wrong. Now, to see how quantum theory encounters consciousness, consider the simple two-slit experiment. A light beam, preferably a laser beam, which has light of only a single frequency, is applied to two slits in an opaque sheet and allowed to fall on a photographic plate. Light passing through one slit interferes with light passing through the other slit to produce an interference pattern of bright bands alternating with dark bands. This is typical of wave behavior and can be easily explained. If light coming from one slit is in phase with the light coming from the other slit, as shown here, reinforcement occurs, which gives rise to a bright band. On the other hand, if light coming from one slit is in opposite phase to the light coming from the other slit, because of the difference in the length of path traveled by light between the two slits, then the two waves cancel out. And a dark band will result. Now, if one slit is closed, there will be just one bright band that gradually becomes fainter and fainter. There is no interference pattern. Now, suppose that the light is made very dim. Spots will be observed on the photographic plate. With time, these spots will build up to produce the same bands that were observed before. But something odd is happening. Light passes through the slits as waves, but unmistakably hits the photographic plate as particles, causing spots. According to quantum theory, all matter and energy have dual particle and wave nature, That is, matter and energy can behave as waves or as particles depending on circumstances. The discrete units of electromagnetic radiation, such as light, are referred to as photons. But what can be said about the light in the region between the source and the plate? Is it a wave or is it a stream of particles? If it is a wave, then how does it hit the plate as particles? If it is a stream of particles, then as a photon passes through a slit, how does it know whether or not the other slit is open or closed, and hence be part of an interference pattern and avoid the regions of the dark bands, or not be part of an interference pattern and have no forbidden regions? What is the interpretation in terms of quantum theory? Well, there are several formulations of quantum theory, all of which give the same results but have different interpretations. The conventional formulation that is almost always applied to solve practical problems is what's referred to as the Copenhagen interpretation, after the Danish theoretical physicist Niels Bohr, who was its chief proponent. So I will stick with this interpretation. Now, according to this interpretation, one cannot follow the path of photons point by point and instant by instant, as in classical mechanics. One can only speak of the probability of finding the photon in a given region at any particular time. To determine this probability, one sets up a wave equation whose solution is the superposition of all the possible and mutually exclusive states of the system. In this case, these states are those of the photon passing through one slit or the other. Now, superposition of the two states implies that both states exist simultaneously. That is, the photon passes through both slits at the same time. How can a particle pass through both slits at the same time is considered rather irrelevant. The photons in transit are in a superposition state, and one cannot say more. Now, the superposition state is resolved when the photons hit the screen and are observed. The mathematical result is then a definite answer, either an interference pattern when both slits are open and no interference pattern when one slit is closed. But what does this have to do with consciousness? Well, in 1932, the renowned mathematician John von Neumann proved rigorously that no physical object that obeys the laws of physics, including quantum theory, can resolve the state of superposition to produce a definite outcome. Only a conscious observer can do so. Now, one may ask, well, what if the plate is not being observed? Will there be an interference pattern or not? Now, according to quantum theory, if the plate is isolated from the environment, it will itself get entangled with the photons in a state of superposition, in which the photographic plate will have both an interference pattern and no interference pattern. Only when the screen is observed by a conscious observer will the outcome be resolved as either an interference pattern or no interference pattern. The logical conclusion is that the reality of interference or no interference is the result of the process of observation. That is, nothing is real until it is observed. Now, Einstein found this implication of quantum theory very disturbing, although he was one of the contributors to quantum theory. He is quoted as saying, "I like to think the moon is there, even if I'm not looking at it." Now, the implications of the conventional mathematical formulation of quantum theory can be very weird. Suppose, for example, that both slits are open, but after the photons have passed through the slits, and before they hit the plate, one of the slits is closed. Will there be an interference pattern? Well, common sense says yes, because the photons have already passed the open slits. But the mathematics says no, there will be no interference pattern. It is as if the photons passed through one slit. In other words, the action of the observer in closing one slit not only affects the outcome, but changes the past history of the photons. And this was actually confirmed experimentally in 2007 when ultra-fast electronic switches became available. So there it goes. The mathematical results have always been correct, but the interpretations and the philosophical implications can be very weird. It is seen that the outcome of the experiment, that is interference or no interference, is determined by a conscious observer, exercising free will in keeping both slits open or closing one slit. A controversial point concerning free will emerged from some psychoneurological experiments started in the early 1980s by neuropsychologist Benjamin Libet. The more sophisticated form of this experiment was performed in 2008 by psychologist John Dylan Haynes using functional magnetic resonance imaging. In this setup, as you can see here roughly, subjects were asked to press a button with their right hand or a button with their left hand when they felt like it. At the same time, letters appeared in front of them on a screen, and they were asked to report the letter they saw when they decided to press one of the buttons. This allowed determination of the time at which they were conscious of having made their free will decision to press either button. Now, one would expect the decision to occur in time before the associated brain activity. That is, a conscious decision made, then brain activity associated with the decision appears, and then the button is pushed. But from the fMRI signal, the researchers could predict in about 70% of the time and up to 10 seconds before the decision time, which button was going to be pressed. That is, brain activity associated with a decision could be predicted from the fMRI image with 70% accuracy up to about 10 seconds before the subject was conscious of making the decision. And then 1 second afterwards, there is a push of the button. Now, does this mean that there is no free will? Well, if the subject is told during the 10-second period that he's going to press a particular button, he could still exercise his free will and press the other button. The results of such experiments have, of course, sparked a lot of debate about what they mean, but there is no general agreement on the interpretation. One recent proposal is that brain activity preceding conscious decisions reflects the decision process rather than decision outcome. And this decision process is configured by conditional intentions that participants form at the beginning of the experiment. It is therefore concluded that such experiments do not negate free will. Next, we turn to the fourth level of consciousness, that of enhanced consciousness, or a higher level of consciousness, which is manifested under certain conditions, the best studied being near-death experiences. These are reported by about 10% to 20% of people who come close to death as a result of serious injury in an accident, for example, such as a car collision or drowning or falling from a height, or during a life-threatening medical condition, such as cardiac arrest, major surgery, or complications of childbirth. To have some idea about NDEs, here is a recount of an NDE by someone who was undergoing a 12-hour surgery for removal of a nerve tissue tumor or neuroma. He says, I floated up to the ceiling where I looked down and saw the medical team dressed in green gowns and caps working seriously over a body. As I observed the process, I realized that was the body I had just left. I had no attachment to it whatsoever. Also, I had no phone. I was like a mist. The next recollection was floating without effort through a dark tunnel to a beautiful yellow-white light. I had no thought of choosing to go there. It just seemed to naturally to draw me to it. I saw no other beings in the tunnel. In the light, there was only pure, beautiful light. No forms, no boundaries, nothing but beautiful white light. The feeling of peace in the light was nothing like I have ever experienced. There was no such thing as time and space. I referred to me as I, but I felt no separation. I knew all there was, and I had all knowledge. At some point, three beings of light, as I called them, came to me. There is no form on the other side, at least not the state of being where I was. Therefore, there are no mouths or ears. All communication is telepathic. The beings told me I must return to my body. In that indescribable state of peace, I did not want to return to my body and told them so. They said I must return, that my mission, my purpose on earth was not yet finished. I had no choice. In hindsight, I appeared to be like a wisp of smoke or mist that re-entered the body at the crown of my head. The next thing I recall is the doctor slapping my face, calling my name. I was back in my body. I opened my eyes to see family and friends standing around me. While in the light as a being of light myself, I was told and shown many things, yet do not recall them. Except as time goes by, wisdom and recognition come to me. I sense from what I was told and shown on the other side. Now, remarkably, the NDEs are consistent and independent of distinguishing characteristics such as culture, religious belief, or age. They are nevertheless individual differences. Some near-death experiencers, for example, report being united with deceased loved ones who appear in the form of beings who are lit from within. And others see a kind of a flash review of their lives. The enhanced consciousness of the NDEs can be summarized as follows. There's detachment from the body, feeling of peace, timelessness and spacelessness, unitive experience, that is the experience of being one with the universe, all knowledge, more vivid visual and auditory sensations, clearer and faster thinking. Now, to be sure, not all NDEs are pleasant. About 8% of NDEs are unpleasant, involving frightening sounds and encounters. A small percentage still are neither pleasant nor unpleasant experiences, only encounter a featureless void. Now, let me emphasize here that this is serious stuff. It's not quackery. The studies are mostly done by reputable psychiatrists, psychologists, and neuroscientists. There is an international association for near-death studies that was established under this name in 1981 to foster research into NDEs and to promote various related activities. The association has been publishing since 1988 a quarterly peer-reviewed journal of near-death studies. Some famous cases of seemingly paranormal aspects of NDEs have been reported by serious investigators and published in reputable scientific journals such as The Lancet and Progress in Brain Research. Now, the first question that comes to mind is, could NDEs be simply hallucinations? People who have experienced both hallucinations and an NDE describe them as being quite different. NDEs differ in many important respects from hallucinations. For example, hallucinations are usually illogical, fleeting, bizarre, and or distorted, whereas the vast majority of NDEs are logical, orderly, clear, and comprehensible. Hallucinations tend to be forgotten. Most NDEs remain vivid for decades. Hallucinations have little or no after effects. NDEs often lead to profound and permanent transformations in personality, attitudes, beliefs, and values. And they may result in a change of career. They affect interpersonal relations. They have even led to divorce in some cases between marital couples. Hallucinations may be of the living or the deceased, whereas NDEs are almost always of the deceased. Now, psychological tests and EEG recordings have revealed that the recall of NDE memories is the same as that of real memories, but differed from that of imagined memories, such as hallucinations. So the conclusion was that NDE memories are stored as episodic memories of events experienced in a peculiar state of consciousness. Now, could NDEs be due to some physiological factors that come into play when death is imminent, such as oxygen deficiency or increased levels of carbon dioxide? Now, tests have indicated that this is not so. Moreover, many physiological parameters are closely monitored and controlled during surgery when many NDEs are experienced. Hallucinatory experiences that share some common features with NDEs can be induced by psychedelic drugs, such as psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, DMT, which also produce effects that do not appear in NDEs. However, this does not mean that NDEs are hallucinations. As pointed out by Dr. Sam Parnia, the notion that a hallucinatory experience occurring in response to one stimulus implies that the response to another stimulus, with or without possible shared features of the responses, is also hallucinatory, is neither consistent with the scientific principles governing the determination of reality, nor with cause and effects. For example, it is incorrect to assume that since hallucinogenic agents can bring about the sensation of love, as in the case of LSD, for example, then other experiences of love, such as mother's love for her child, are also hallucinatory. One cannot assume that a person's love is real or hallucinatory based on the underlying neurobiological correlates of love, such as the release of dopamine or oxytocin or vasopressin. These are various types of hormones, as they are similar, irrespective of whether love is experienced in response to hallucinogenic or a real trigger. Now, an intriguing aspect of NDEs are accounts of visual perceptions by people who were blind at birth, from birth. This does not mean that they are able to see what they report on in the same way that sighted people do. Such accounts have been referred to as mind sight. And according to the main investigator of such cases, that's Dr. Kenneth Ring, the form of knowing reported by the blind during their NDEs is beyond conventional scientific explanation and is in fact of the same form of transcendent knowing that is reported by the sighted during their NDEs. So what does this all mean? Well, NDEs remain essentially anecdotal recounts that cannot be objectively verified because they are purely subjective. However, no single neurophysiological or psychological explanation has been able to account for all features of NDEs. It may well be that NDEs involve more than one mechanism. Some scientists believe that NDEs can be explained within the present scientific framework, whereas others believe that they are beyond conventional scientific explanation. Nevertheless, NDEs raise some interesting and problematic issues. For example, here is the observation that NDEs involve clearer than ever thoughts and perceptions from outside the body, while brain function is at least severely impaired. The implication is that mind and brain are separate entities. Again, we come back to dualism. Mind exists outside the body. Observation, flash review of one's life, involving images of exquisite detail recalled at very high speed, while brain function is at least severely impaired. The implication, could memory be stored outside the brain? Observation, deceased relatives may tell the NDE experiencer something he didn't know. Implication, the deceased have consciousness and memory long after they died and their bodies decomposed. Observation, consciousness is at a higher level than in the normal state, as in more vivid, sorry, as in more vivid visual and auditory sensations and a feeling of all knowledge. Now, the implication here is that the brain constrains consciousness in the normal state. And this last implication seems to accord with suggestions since many years ago, going back to the 1950s and the writings of Aldous Huxley, that the mind belongs to a greater realm and that the brain acts as a filter that focuses and limits the mind and consciousness to what is important and relevant for our survival and daily activities. It is interesting in this regard that neuroimaging studies on the effect of psychedelic drugs, which can induce something like enhanced consciousness, have shown that the brain in this state has a higher degree of randomness or disorder, manifested in less synchrony of brain activity, which is technically described as a state of higher entropy. So here, for example, from this article, the entropy suppressing function of the human brain, that is order promoting in terms of more synchrony in brain activity, serves to promote realism, careful reflection, and an ability to recognize and overcome wishful thinking and paranoid fantasies. Equally, however, it would be seen as exerting a limiting or narrowing influence on our consciousness. Now, this limitation of the brain on consciousness is starkly expressed in the quotation by Dr. Larry Dorsey. We are conscious not because of the brain, but in spite of it. Now, considering that the mind belongs to a greater realm implies external influences, which is a completely different paradigm. The idea of external influences is not new in biology. Some embryologists in the 1920s introduced the idea of morphogenetic fields to explain some puzzling features of morphogenesis, that is, how embryos develop. Genes code for proteins to be synthesized in a now well-understood manner. During morphogenesis, cells differentiate so that some cells become skin cells, for example, whereas other cells become muscle cells or nerve cells. Different genes are expressed, that is, become active in these different types of cells. But what directs this process? What directs the formation of whole organs like the brain or the heart or the stomach? And what directs the form of a developing limb to be that of an arm or a leg and in the right position compared to other body parts, and of arms or legs to be almost mirror images on the two sides of the body? Are the instructions for structure and form also coded in the genome? Materialists say yes, but in a manner that is still undiscovered, but certain to be discovered in the future. Again, this is an example of counterfactual definiteness. Now, a biologist, Rupert Sheldrake, developed this idea of morphogenetic fields into what he calls morphic fields. According to Sheldrake, every unit of form or organization, including animals, plants, atoms, planets, planetary systems, etc., has within it and around it a morphic field that organizes its characteristic structure and pattern of activity and underlies its behavior at all levels of complexity. According to Sheldrake, memory is in the morphic field, not in the brain. That is why all attempts to localize memory in the brain have failed so far. Instinctive behavior of animals is governed by the morphic field. Social insects, such as bees and ants, exhibit some complex forms of collective behavior. Consider mounds built by termites or white ants, such as this. These are huge. They can be up to 5 meters high and 30 meters in diameter at the base here. These large and quite complex structures have a huge number of interconnecting tunnels and chambers built by many thousands of worker termites acting together. The worker termites are blind, but can use other senses, such as smell or vibrations. The tunnels and chambers are not built haphazardly. The mounds are designed to regulate temperature, humidity, and air distribution. But what directs the termites and coordinates their activities? Where is the blueprint for the termite mound? Is all this information stored and processed in the brain of a termite? That does not seem likely. The ant colony is said to have a collective consciousness, whatever that means. Now, an interesting analogy of morphic field and the brain is that of a television set. A person who is unfamiliar with broadcasting and the generation, propagation, and reception of electromagnetic waves, like someone suddenly resurrected from a past era, would reasonably assume that what is seen on a TV screen is generated in the TV set itself. This view is supported by the fact that any tinkering with the components of the set will generally affect the image on the screen or might remove it altogether. But in fact, the TV set is just tuning to an outside signal and is merely processing this signal into a form that can be perceived by the viewer. Similarly, brains may be tuning to something external and are merely processing or filtering this something. Now, a more general viewpoint from physics is David Bohm's formulation of quantum theory. Bohm, who is considered as one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists of his generation, the generation that followed that of Einstein and Niels Bohr, proposes that at the subquantum level, everything in the universe is connected with everything else over all space and all time that has passed. This fundamental level of reality is what he calls the implicate order. What we observe in everyday life as separate objects and entities is the explicate order. The analogy here is that of a hologram. The holographic image that one sees is analogous to the explicate order. But this image arises from the recorded interference pattern of the hologram, which is analogous to the implicate order. According to Bohm, this universal connectedness and wholeness encompasses everything: matter, consciousness, spirit. Even Sheldrake's morphic fields are part of this unbroken wholeness. The observer problem mentioned with the Copenhagen interpretation of the two-slit experiment does not arise in Bohm's interpretation of quantum theory. The photons, the sheet having the slits, the photographic plate, and the observer are not separate entities at the level of the implicate order. They are all part of this order. Bohm even speculates on how his theory can be extended to encompass parapsychological phenomena, such as telepathy, that is communicating by the exchange of thoughts without involving the senses, and psychokinesis, that is the production or control of motion, especially of remote and inanimate objects, by the exercise of psychic powers. Needless to say, Sheldrake's and Bohm's ideas are controversial and are outside the framework of conventional science. They may well be wrong, but at least they introduce different paradigms that seek to explain phenomena that have not been satisfactorily explained by conventional science. This idea of universal wholeness and connectedness is beautifully expressed in William Blake's famous poem. To see a world in a grain of sand and the heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Now, to sum up, in the encounter of science with consciousness, consciousness is still an unfathomably deep mystery. To understand consciousness, the present-day framework of science either must be expanded to encompass consciousness or be replaced by a new framework altogether. This is the conclusion of an increasing number of scientists and philosophers. But how to achieve these objectives remains elusive. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Professor Sabah. This is extremely interesting and enriching. And I can't claim that I understood everything, by the way. I'm quite sure that we'll have questions from guests. So I open the floor for questions. Please, let's have a question at a time, and then you open your microphones. raise hands. كيف تعمل? How to make it? Mr. Rami Mhanna.
Hello, and thank you for this wonderful talk, Dr. Sabah.
Oh, hello,
thank
Rami.
you for, how are you? Thanks for also organizing this talk. So I actually have a question, a generic question. Sorry for the noises around me, but this is the kids' time. So often we had, questioned about the conscious and especially about mysteries of the brain, but then every now and then you have a new discovery that sets forward an answer to a previous question. So for instance, what drives love? What drives excitement? There's lots of chemicals in the brain, exotonin, adrenaline, etc., were discovered later on and explained that there are chemical processes that take place and drive those. The questions that you also rose about, how does the body develop? Eventually, differentiation of stem cells leads later on to specific cells downwards that are guided by a genetic expression, and then growth factors of other cells constrain those cells so that they don't expand further in the body, and that's what limits their growth within the body. So there are many questions that you posed also that have already a scientific answer to them. And so my question, do you think that it is possible we will reach a time that many of the questions that we're asking get answered, and we already have a more materialistic, explanation of how the brain functions?
Well, that is an open question. To assert that yes, it will be possible to explain everything in terms of physics and chemistry is again a case of a counterfactual definiteness. So it is an open question. However, the points that you raised, yes, I am aware of them. But you see, as Chalmers pointed out, associating certain types of brain activity with subjective experiences or whatever is not a proof of cause and effect. The fundamental question is why should these physical activities give rise to subjective phenomena? This is the question that some people ask. Of course, some people say, well, that just doesn't arise. I mean, the physical processes are themselves the subjective phenomena. So that is still an open question. The second point that you raised about morphogenesis, well, embryonic development is known only in very, very general terms. But the details of the process are far, far, far from being worked out. How do arms and legs develop, for instance? How do they develop in the right place? And how is it that the two arms or the two legs are almost mirror images of one another? What directs these processes? There are so many unanswered questions. As a famous theoretical physicist, John Wheeler said, he said, our knowledge is like an island surrounded by a sea of ignorance. The more our knowledge grows, so does our ignorance.
Professor Sabah, I think Professor Khairallah has a question.
Okay.
And a question was sent to me, a written question. Let me first pose this question, which was sent to me. Can you elaborate more on the morphic field and its allocation for the human beings? And then I give the screen to Dr. Khairallah if he has comments or questions. So did you get the question, Professor Sabah?
Yes, well, I really didn't have the time to go into more details about morphic fields and also Bohm's intricate order because of time limitations. Well, morphic fields that were proposed by Sheldrake, these are fields that are in a hierarchical organization. So that in fact they affect and they control all behavior of organisms at every particular level. One aspect of morphic fields, which is very interesting, is that take, for example, instinctive behavior of animals. According to Sheldrake, the instinctive behavior of animals is mostly in the morphic field, and that the behavior of an animal feeds back into the morphic field, so that if it proves to be advantageous to the species, it becomes part of the morphic field. So in fact, each animal, for instance, has its own morphic field, which may have, in the case of humans, its memories and so on, as well as a group morphic field. And that was what was. Now there is, as far as I'm aware, there is no really direct evidence that has been proposed for morphic fields, except what was done in the 1920s concerning rats, learning of in a maze by rats by the psychologist at Harvard, where he observed that learning by rats improved with the generations. That is, the first generation took about 160 trials to learn the maze, to correctly behave, whereas with later generations, the number of trials dropped down to about 26. And that was shown not to be due to any selective inbreeding. Then about the same time, a researcher in Scotland decided to replicate the experiments. And to his surprise, his rats in Scotland started off where the rats in Harvard left. That is, they started out with about 20 trials and they improved as they go along. Similarly, someone in Australia did the same thing and had the same results. Now, of course, Sheldrake argues very strongly, and he has books on the subject for the morphic field, and he claims that there are proofs that this is the case. But of course, it is controversial, and I'm not defending it. I'm not saying that it is right, but at least it's a different paradigm that seeks to explain something that cannot be explained by conventional science. Take, for instance, brain memory. Take for instance, memory. Where is memory in the brain? Well, we go back to the famous experiments by Lashley, where he removed parts of the cortex, and the rats did not forget how to run the maze. He removed a huge amount. Well, of course, the performance did deteriorate, but the rats still remembered. And the parts that he removed were from different regions of the cortex. Now, all attempts to localize memory in the brain have so far failed. What can be done, and this has been done with recent experiments using the optogenetics, is that you can see some neurons light up, for instance, with memory when the memory is being recalled, or when memory is being sort of learned or recorded. But that does not localize memory. It just shows which neurons are taking part in the process. Any kind of mental activity will have a neural association. But where is memory? Where is memory localized in the brain? How is it localized? It's not, apparently, and that led, for example, Carl Pribram to propose the analogy of a hologram, that memory is holographic, that is one part of a hologram will code information about the whole image. so that if you cut a hologram in half, you can still get the image. If you subdivide it more and more, you still get the same image. There is some deterioration in the quality of the image, but you can still recover the whole image. So I'm afraid that is, of course, circumstantial evidence, but this is what Sheldrake claims, that in fact memory is not stored in the brain, it is stored in the morphic field.
It's on the cloud.
Professor Khairallah, your question?
Are you hearing me?
Yes, yes, indeed. Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, well, it's a wonderful, wonderful, very impressive lecture, really. One learns a lot in some minutes after all. But I wanted to ask you, how much do you think the Muslim Sufis, because this is our field of literature and spiritual tradition, have had insights into this kind of NDE experiences, because they seem to talk about controlling things from afar and going into some kind of unity with the whole complex universe. And do you think, I don't know how much you're acquainted with them, but do you think there is some kind of early insight into these things without the modern scientific machines and experimentation and stuff?
Well, of course, there has been the mystical experiences since very ancient times,
yeah,
where the mystics claim to have such experiences of feeling oneness with the universe and timelessness and spacelessness and so on. So the ideas they're not new in that respect, but they are new to science.
yeah.
But they have long been sort of stated by mysticists, by philosophers, and even by the ordinary people. Sometimes get this sort of mystical moment.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, of course, religious traditions do touch on some of these aspects, but I'm only interested from the scientific point of view. That
yes, of course.
Now this has entered. Now this has
you want them to be
the
concrete.
of scientists.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Fascinating.
You're most welcome.
Other questions or comments? If not, I do have a question, Professor Sabah, if you permit.
Of course.
Talking about the experiment of measuring this 10 seconds or whatever splits of seconds in the experiment there, pushing the button. And you mentioned something about monitoring and measuring how a free will decision is being taken. Could you please explain more on this? I didn't get it.
No. What?
In the relation with the free will, the relation with making the decision in splits of seconds, pushing the button. You said something was able to be measured.
Yeah. Well, what was being measured is the brain activity as reflected in the magnetic resonance image. That is, the subject was in a magnetic resonance imaging machine, and his brain activity was being monitored all the time. Now, when he decides, for instance, to press a button, there is associated brain activity, obviously. And this brain activity was analyzed, that is online, using, of course, computers, to see if they can predict from the brain activity that is seen in the magnetic resonance image which button is going to be pressed. And they found that in 70% of the cases, they could tell from the results of processing of the magnetic resonance image which button is going to be pressed. Now, some, of course, have said that this negates free will, but that is not at all certain. And as I mentioned here recent paper that appeared about a year and a half ago, they claim that more careful analysis of the decision process shows that it is in fact the decision process is what is being seen. That is, it's not the outcome. What they see. You see, for instance, and that can be roughly understood. For example, if you want to do something, you have an intention first of all, before you actually do the act, and this intention is related to whether you do this or that, whether you press this button or whether you're going to press that button. You're sort of debating it in your mind before you take the decision. And that it is this process that is being recorded and analyzed. It's not the decision itself. The decision itself comes later, but the process can be biased towards making one decision or the other. And that is reflected in the fact that they could tell in about 70% of the time, not correctly every time. So that is the idea. The prediction is from the analysis of the image, the magnetic resonance image of brain activity.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions, comments? Now, going back to consciousness, where do you see or how do you predict that research on consciousness, all these variety, myriad prospects, can you see any specific directions where the research about consciousness, human consciousness, is heading to?
Well, it's not so clear at all. You see, there are different groups and different individuals working on the problem. Each have their own ideas and proposals. For instance, Chalmers, the same one who poses the easy problem and the hard problem of consciousness, he proposes that consciousness be considered as a basic entity like length and mass and time, and be incorporated in a new physics, so that this new physics will not be just dealing with mass, length, time, charge, and so on, but also with consciousness as a basic unit. Well, of course, that has not been done. Work on the implicate order and the explicate order, that is Bohm's work. Unfortunately, Bohm died in 1991. He had co-workers that were working on the same problem, but they have not yet come up with anything definite. That is the mathematical processes involving in going between the implicate order and the explicate order. So there are, of course, many. So there are many ideas. Many people are trying to enlarge the scope of science to include consciousness, and that is definitely the way science is going to develop. But how soon and how, no one can really tell at this moment.
Thank you very much indeed. So if there are no more questions, we very much at the Anis Makdisi program appreciate this brilliant lecture, Professor Sabah. Thank you very much. And I hope we'll have other occasions perhaps to discuss other concepts or other aspects of this relation, consciousness between science and the humanities, which is very enriching indeed. Thank you very much again.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Maher. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, and good night.